Now, not everyone was a social Darwinist who believed that basically screw poor people. There were several groups that advocated for reform, who saw this system of economic inequality, this gap between the rich and the poor, as something that did require action and effort. So, one group in particular that's talking about the issue of reform for the working classes are labor unions and movements. And the Knights of Labor is one of the biggest labor groups in the United States in the 1880s. At their peak in 1886, they had about 800,000 members across the United States. The Knights of Labor made the argument that Gilded Age workers were very much the same in terms of status as African American slaves had been before the Civil War. That's a pretty bold statement. So, how are they backing that up? They're basically saying that the lack of regulation of business and the levels of political corruption that we see in Gilded Age politics had meant that there was no economic opportunity, no mobility, no guarantee of quality of life for the lower classes. That in theory they could quit their jobs and move, but in reality it's very difficult because it'd be difficult for them to find replacement jobs. Some companies at this time actually paid their workers in goods rather than money, so it's very difficult for them to be able to save to be able to move. Some workers actually lived in company owned housing. So the reality was is these workers didn't have freedom. So that's what the Knights of Labor were arguing. So according to the Knights of Labor, one way to fix this issue of economic inequality was to embrace equality of condition, to create this kind of basic minimum standard of living for everyone in the United States. So things like a minimum wage or, housing standards, something to kind of create a bottom in American society that people couldn't fall underneath. So, because of that, the Knights of Labor advocated for reforms like an 8-hour workday, um, unemployment relief, overtime pay. The problem was that for the Knights of Labor and other labor organizers, they believed that this was sort of a humanitarian issue, right? They didn't like the fact that people were homeless or going hungry or exploited. However, the owners of the companies that these workers worked for viewed these kinds of demands not as a desire for better safety and living conditions, but as violations of their freedoms as business owners to run their businesses as they saw fit. This is the idea we call liberty of contract, that true freedom is the ability of businesses and individuals to form contracts with no outside interference by the government. So, groups like the Knights of Labor are pushing for laws to protect workers, to give them safer workplaces, to give them better pay, better conditions. And what we start to see happen is even when we do see state and local governments pass these kinds of laws, when these laws are contested up to the US Supreme Court, again and again, the court finds in favor of the businesses and not the workers. The Supreme Court at this time is using the 14th Amendment selectively to define liberty of contract as the primary definition of freedom. So, in other words, any law that messed with the way a business chose to run itself, they saw as illegal. Um, so we see that over and over again. For example, in Wabash v. Illinois, states could not regulate interstate commerce. Illinois had actually tried to set rail prices to address the complaint, especially by farmers, of price gouging. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't. United States versus E.C. Knight Company, the Sherman Antitrust Act was basically said you could only use it to monitor commerce and not manufacturing. The Sherman Antitrust Act, as we talked about in our Gilded Age session, was originally designed to break up big monopolies, but it wasn't being used that way. At the time of the U.S. v. E.C. Knight Company ruling in 1895, the Sherman Antitrust Act was usually used against unions to break up strikes. And probably one of the more important Supreme Court cases from this time period that's actually gotten a lot more discussion in recent years because of the direction the Supreme Court seems to be going when it comes to workers' rights is Lochner v. New York. The Lochner v. New York case in 1905 overturned laws in New York designed to set maximum hours for bakers. If you've ever worked as a professional baker, it is a grueling job. And New York had tried to pass a law that said you can't have bakers work longer than 10 hours at a time or 60-hour work week without paying them overtime. And the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't regulate working hours because that's telling businesses how to run themselves, and that's bad. Similarly, we see other cases, like, for example, the Supreme Court ruled against a Kansas law prohibiting making membership required for hiring in unions. They also passed judgment and laws designed to prohibit companies from paying workers in goods. That was struck down. Or things like, workers have to purchase supplies through company-owned stores. That was upheld. So again and again, anytime we start to see regulations being passed by governments at different levels to try to help workers by requiring things like standard working hours or overtime pay, or that you should be paid in money, all of these things get overturned. And this is a big concern for workers, because even when reformers are successful in passing laws, when these laws are legally challenged, they're being smacked down. Now, it's not just workers themselves who are concerned over inequality, but it's also people belonging to the middle class. So in other words, people who are solidly comfortable financially, but they're not members of this outrageously wealthy elite. The reason that middle class folks cared about the issue of poverty was they feared that if this social and economic inequality got worse, this would lead to class warfare and violent conflict. And so again, kind of for the stability of American society, they really want to address this gap. Now, there are two sort of movements for reform that we see among the middle class during the late 1800s. They have some shared commonalities. They both emerge out of religious communities, but their approaches to dealing with issues of poverty are very different. So the first is the idea of morality laws, and this comes out of Protestant Christianity in the United States. So people who supported morality laws made the argument that the way to improve life for people in the working class was to stamp out sin on an individual level. So according to them, the way you improve lives for workers is to basically pass laws to encourage them to behave better or more morally. So these reformers basically wanted to enshrine Protestant Christian definitions of morality into law. So for these people, they're looking at passing laws regulating alcohol, sale and consumption, gambling, prostitution, polygamy, birth control use, all things they saw as undesirable behavior, and that if you pass laws regulating these things, then you would encourage people to live more good moral lives, and therefore their lives would improve. These kinds of laws and reforms are especially popular in the South, the region nicknamed the Bible Belt, because they felt that this was the best way to improve lives for these workers. And while a lot of these reformers have success at the state level, they find it more difficult to kind of regulate a lot of these things at the national level until after 1900, particularly when we think about things like alcohol. Alcohol consumption and production is going to be a state-by-state issue until we finally get to the 18th Amendment, which creates prohibition at the national level, which bans the sale and production of alcohol. More on that in a later session. The other movement we see emerge among religious communities is a movement called the social gospel movement. So the social gospel movement starts in Protestant Christian churches, but is also very popular amongst Catholic Christian churches within the United States. People who believed in the social gospel felt that for true Christian community and brotherhood, there needed to be a more equal distribution of wealth and power. And so, believers in the social gospel wanted to help the lower classes not only by providing charity and short term relief aid, but also by changing the system for the better by pushing for reform at the legal level, by creating legislation to support workers' rights and better working conditions. So, some of the main writers of the social gospel movement at this time period are Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Baptist minister from New York City, and Washington Gladden, a Congregationalist minister from Columbus, Ohio. So, social gospel reformers um, acted on their reform movements by opening missions or centers for poor people to distribute aid in their neighborhoods. They worked with labor unions and labor organizers to push for laws promoting worker health and safety. And one of the reasons why this movement jumps over to the Catholic Church in a way that the morality law movement didn't is because there's a lot of people in the working class, a lot of immigrants at this time period who are Catholics. So there's a big impact to local parishioners uh, of this movement. So the Catholic Church has a lot more in common with this movement than, say, the morality laws, where ideas about or attitudes about alcohol, for example, are very different between Protestant Christians versus Catholic Christians. So it was a much harder sell, the morality laws, to the Catholic community. But the social gospel movement, because it wasn't trying to impose one definition of morality on people, but instead advocate more generally to help people and improve their lives, both legally and through charity, that made it a little easier to transfer across different religious beliefs.